You're listening to the Wilmac Wire, the podcast that's designed to give you a glimpse into a growing SaaS company, specifically in the realm of customer interaction technology. From customer experience to data management, we'll talk about it here. Thank you for tuning in. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Wilmac Wire. My name is Emily Miller, and I'm coming to you from the Wilmac Technologies headquarters in downtown Rochester, a very festively decorated office for the holiday season. I have to shout out Alex Reed for doing a great job decorating. If you're watching the YouTube video, you can see a nice little Merry Christmas sign behind me, and we've got a lot of other fun stuff going on around the office. But just because it's the holiday season, the grind doesn't stop. So for today's episode of the Wilmac Wire, we are recapping one of our most recent webinars that we recorded, the title of which is 3 Scenarios You Find Yourself in Simplifying Compliance with Customer Interaction Data. You're going to hear from Bob Pease, our VP of Engineering, and Charlie Snedden, our Sales Engineer, as they discuss, like it's in the title, 3 scenarios or challenges that our customers are facing, that you might be facing, as they navigate managing their customer interaction data, their call recordings, their emails, their web chats, screen recordings, especially as they face retention regulations around that data. So I'm going to turn it over to Bob and Charlie to discuss these challenges through anecdotes from our customers, through success stories, and then tying it back into how our continuity replay solution plays into this mix. So I'm going to hand it over to Bob and Charlie for today's episode. Thank you again for tuning in to the Wilmac Wire, and I'll see you back here shortly.
Good morning and welcome to our webinar. You have joined 3 scenarios you find yourself in simplifying compliance with customer interaction data. My name is Emily Miller from Wilmac Technologies, and I'll be moderating the webinar this morning. And before I hand it over to our speakers for the day, I just wanted to run through a few housekeeping items. So to start off, all participants have been muted. If you have any questions or comments, find the chat box on the left-hand side of your screen and enter anything in there, any questions or comments in there. So we have reserved time at the end of the webinar for Q&A, but if we don't get to your question there, someone from the Wilmac team will reach out to you individually afterwards to answer your question. Now, also, there are multiple resources that you can find on the left-hand side of your screen. So downloadable resources is what I mean. That includes our most recent ebook on the subject, an infographic, a use case overview, and even a case study. And like I mentioned, you may download those at any time throughout the webinar. So to introduce our speakers today, to start off, we have Bob Pease, our Vice President of Engineering at Wilmac Technologies, and joining him for the conversation is Charlie Snedden, one of our sales engineers at Wilmac Technologies. And if you know him at all, he is an expert on everything. So Charlie and Bob, thank you both for joining us today. Before I pass it over fully to Bob and Charlie to dive into that first scenario, I do want to give a brief introduction to this topic. Now, most of you on this call are likely subject to stringent retention periods, to multi-year regulations around your customer interaction data, your call recordings, your emails, web chats, your SMS text messages, even screen recordings. And now as you evolve as an organization, you're transitioning to new technologies, you're going up into the cloud. In these situations, they make your data management and compliance with those retention periods all that more complicated. It's a very complex situation to deal with. Then you add on top of that, you need to access that data, but it's a proprietary format, or it's encrypted, or the legacy system that you're hosting it on, it's facing end of life or end of support. There are certain scenarios and challenges that bring about this realization. I need access and greater control over this data immediately, as soon as possible. So our goal in today's webinar is to discuss 3 common challenges that you and our customers have been able to navigate. And our role at Wilmac Technologies is to empower you with a simple data management tool in a complex situation. So I will now hand it over to Bob and Charlie to get things started.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to start today's discussion. We're going to cover 3 scenarios. And the first discussion I want to have with you, Bob, is what do customers do when they're transitioning or decommissioning legacy systems? Or if I was to rephrase that, how should companies handle transitions between telephony contact centers and data storage vendors? And that's a question because I feel that there's many organizations out there today and in the future that will have on-premise solutions that have call recordings, and the future for those solutions that they're using is the cloud. The upgrade path, if you will, for their current solutions to the cloud. So that gives us a case of not just transitioning, but they have to decommission that system. So how do you think that kind of ventures into the control of data and compliance rules?
For me, the first thing that comes up is how do I mitigate my risk as an organization? And what things are at risk? Control of your data, proprietary formats, some of these legacy solutions that organizations have, compliance rules. How are you going to maintain your compliance rules across different systems? And then, of course, migrating between different storage platforms. So that's all of your risks. So I think we'll kind of go back to the top and talk those through like one at a time, right? So first is risk of losing control of your data. That problem really manifests because as you expand your organization's technology portfolio, you have more systems. They don't always match in terms of what access controls do they give you, what auditing tools are they giving you, et cetera. So really, that's where we come in, right? We step in and help solve that problem by giving you that central pane for all of your data, where your access controls and the way you manage your data lifecycle is going to remain constant throughout our application.
Yeah, and I think I've seen that myself in organizations where they might have a call recording solution, a QM solution, they might have a survey solution as well, which has a copy of the call recording. So essentially what you've got there is three platforms with the same audio, the same call recording or web chat or email, and three disparate solutions. So you have to log into three platforms. And I think that's what you mean by losing control. You don't have it in a single place where you can say, yep, that's safe and secure. I know where it is. I know where it's going if I need to export it or I need to lock it down, that type of thing.
The more systems you have to maintain, that's really where the risk comes in, right? It's really hard to go from one system to another, keep track of who has access and controlling that access. That's 100% what I was talking about there. The next problem folks run into, proprietary formats, right?
If you've got multiple systems, you're going to have different formats.
Yeah. At Wilmac, through Continuity Replay, we have the ability to convert those proprietary formats, transcode them to OpenWave, Opus. We spend a lot of time working with our customers to figure out what's the correct, destination format that's going to make that's going to be the most beneficial for their business moving forward. But that's a huge value prop, right? If your data's in a proprietary format, that's a lot harder to get to without having the original system that it's integrated with. So being able to remove that is going to reduce your friction and reduce the amount of technologies, which reduces your risk overall.
Yeah. So essentially, what you're saying there is it's not just a case of copying those files from the platform and putting them into a drive that I have access to, because they're in those proprietary formats, or possibly even because they're encrypted with a software vendor's key. I, as a user, just can't play them. I can't listen to them. I can't view them. And what you're saying is Wilmac Continuity Replay takes that away and makes it easier when they can be played?
That's exactly correct. And we have a couple of ways you can address how you replay your call recordings. One is through our web user interface. We have a media player right in the app, so you can play them through your web browser, assuming you have permissions within our application to do so. And of course, we have export options, right? Which is why that OpenWave that open format really matters, whether it's Opus, OpenWave, it's MP3. When you extract data out of our system, we're going to give it to you in a way that's compatible with the media players you might have on your computer, or whoever you're giving the files to. We'll have the ability to play them.
And that's where we can begin to tie that into the compliance. You mentioned compliance earlier, and the fact that we have access to those audio files now, the fact that we have role-based access controls within Continuity Replay, you can still ensure that the security and the compliance to the security rules that your team or even the legislative bodies put on you is met. So we're still having them in a secure environment. They're still encrypted, but you now have potentially all of your systems, all of your legacy systems, your older systems in a single place. And that helps us keep the kind of lights on with the data without actually having to keep those systems up and running, which in themselves is a compliance concern for some organizations. If software falls out of support, that is a red flag for the compliance teams.
Yeah, it is. And it happens all the time, right? Especially with, older on-prem systems. There's a lot of overhead that goes into managing those systems, pushing out updates. A lot of times versions of your software will run into end of life, and that forces an organization and their team responsible for that software, to go through, upgrade or migration paths, which can be painful.
Okay. And earlier on, we discussed storage platforms. Yeah. There's a big story that I was reading recently that there's organizations moving to the cloud, but there's now organizations moving out of the cloud back to on-premise because they can control their data. It's not in somebody else's cloud, or it's not in multiple vendors. It's not in Azure. It's not in AWS. It's not in other storage vendors. They can bring it all together. And I guess when it's migrated into continuity, we have the ability to either keep those storage locations or merge them into one.
Yes, that's correct. So in the cloud version, you can store it within our cloud, right? And our storage. If you have your own cloud infrastructure within your organization, whether it be GCP, Microsoft Azure, AWS, we can configure Continuity Replay to be able to connect into those storage systems securely. And again, we work with our customers to define how are we going to securely connect and make sure that your data is protected. Not every architecture of Continuity Replay is exactly the same across all of our customer base. We try to remain flexible to make sure we can meet all the security standards an organization might have in place. But then, of course, if you have on-prem data and you want to leave it on-prem, we have an approach for that as well, to still run Continuity Replay and be able to connect to your on-prem storage.
Okay, that's excellent. I think with Continuity Replay for the purposes of legacy systems, I think from my point of view, is a clear step forward in what needs to be done. I've worked with companies in the past who have changed their platforms. Maybe they've moved from one ACD vendor to another, or they've moved from on-prem to cloud, and they've got a ton. Literally thousands, millions, and even billions worth of calls and interactions that they don't know what to do with. And it's like a needle in a haystack when they're coming to look at maybe audits or GDPR or some other type of data protection. And we'll cover that later on in today's call as well. I think under scenario 3 we were talking about facing audits. We can talk about GDPR and other data protection requirements there. But if we move on. One of the other scenarios that we've been looking at with customers is, what can they do to simplify the management of multiple environments, whether it's due to, mergers and acquisition, divestiture, or multiple modalities. And when we say modalities, we're talking voice, screen, IMs, that type of thing.
And I think the big question that comes up is, how do companies simplify this, right?
Right.
And really comes down to consolidation, getting all of your data in one central platform. It's going to allow you to have that consistent access and those consistent policies across the organization, regardless of what the source is. And that's what we do really, really well within Continuity Replay. For companies to simplify their management of multiple environments, whether it's through M&A or multiple modalities, we're really talking about how we consolidate to a centralized platform. And the way that we achieve that through Continuity Replay is with a concept that we call our common model. So every data source that we ingest, we sit down with our customer at the start of that project to identify what's the source data, what pieces of information are critical to your organization, and then we map those to our common model attributes. And the common model becomes what you see and interact with in our search and replay screen. A few examples of common model properties are things like agent name, Annie or Venus, the time that the call was taken, a group or a scale that might apply. All of those attributes might have slightly varying names from your source data, but we're going to map them to our common model, and that's where you're going to use to search and replay most of the time. What's really great about continuity replay, though, is as we ingest that data and we're mapping it to our common model, we take a non-destructive ingestion approach. And what I mean by that is we ingest all of your source data and we keep that intact in our system as well. So what you have is, your source data, let's say it comes through with, 10 attributes. We're going to map that to the 10 corresponding attributes of our common model, which is going to give you a combination of 20 attributes in total. And what's really cool is we have all this great search and replay functionality based off of the common model, but we still allow you to interact with that source, those source attributes. So that at the end of the day, you have as much data as possible for you to be able to go and search and replay and run your business against those interactions.
So if I kind of rephrase what you said there, that common model allows us to manage multiple platforms. So if you've got calls in one platform, you've got meetings from another, you've got survey forms, that type of thing. Those might refer to agents, they might refer to CSRs, they might refer to people. And what we do is we can kind of merge that information into our common model. So when we're searching 3-4 different platforms, we don't need to know that in one system is called an agent, when one system is a CSR and that type of thing. So that makes it much easier. And similarly, that also allows us to separate the data. So if we're talking about mergers and acquisition, if we flick on that, the other side, if say you've got 100 million calls, and it's 2-3 lines of business, but maybe one of those lines is being sold to another organization, and that data has to be removed from your environment, then we can do that through continuity as well.
That's right. And that kind of bleeds into something else that, is floating around in the back of my head. What's the purpose of the common model, right? And it's all for us to build in all the great things continuity replay does against the same attributes every time. It gives us one implementation that's going to output the same functionality. Great example of this is your retention policy, right? As you're ingesting data, we can set what the retention policy is and enable auto purge functionality from continuity replay to make sure that you're only keeping the data for as long as you need it.
Yeah, and that's a great thing as well, because I've worked with some customers in the past who have this data, and when working with us with continuity replay, they're like, "Oh, we've kept everything. How can we limit or reduce the size of the storage that we have? How can we ensure that we've got the information that we're only supposed to keep?" Because that's, having information, especially from my history back in the UK, if you were keeping data that wasn't necessary for the purpose or the job that you were delivering or the service that you were delivering to the customer, then that was not correct. You weren't supposed to be keeping that data. And I guess that kind of smoothly transitions into scenario 3, facing audits. There's so many different types of audits out there. There's your security and compliance audits. There's your data protection. There's different types of audits with different types of data as well. So I guess how can continuity replay help customers prepare for those audits that are down the line and to come?
That's a loaded question. So let me jump in with I think the first topic, right, is you've been audited. You've been asked to produce, an output of a set of recorded calls and the metadata for audit purposes. That's the, main functionality. That's the bread and butter of what continuity replay does really, really well. So through our search and replay screen, you can go through and identify exactly what calls need to be exported out of our system, produce that export, and then securely hand it off to your auditor. So that's part one. Other things that continuity replay can help with, redacting sensitive information. This kind of ties back into the last point about mergers and acquisitions. You might take over a system that has data from 10 years ago, and you need to run a PCI process against it to redact a bunch of data. That's something that we can help with using AI to help redact older calls to make sure that PCI data, so your data is not contaminated at the end of the day.
So you were talking about PCI data there as well, but that can be extended to other data requirements like HIPAA, PII information, personal information. So that redaction services could be quite handy for platforms, especially if it's not to be provided. And I think, again, for me, that moves into things like the GDPR, the CCPA, where consumers and customers have the rights. They have rights to things like deletion. They have rights to ensure that the data is secure. And having a platform like Continuity Replay allows you to demonstrate that, not only to the customer who says, I want to, have those calls deleted, but also to those auditing bodies who say, have you deleted this? Or, can you prove that it's a secure and safe system?
Yeah. And, I think another area that really applies to these audits is how is an organization protecting their interactions within any system, right? Continuity Replay has very robust audit logging as well. Mm-hmm. So every action that a user takes within our platform has an audit trail that our users can gain access to as well. That data is accessible through the web UI as well as our API. So we even have some customers that are integrating with our API to pull audit logs out of our system to put into their SIEM system, such as Splunk. But then furthermore, we're able to audit the full life cycle of your data as well. One of the key things for Continuity Replay is being able to set the retention period for your data in a bulk way, right? So rather than having to go through and manually set your retention period across millions of interactions, that would be very time consuming, right? So we have a rules engine. As we ingest your data, we can apply those retention periods. So let's say your retention period is 3 years. How do you know that data was deleted when that period expires? That's going to be registered in your audit logs as well. So you're really able to see the full flow of data through Continuity Replay using our audit logs.
Yeah, so I guess all those kind of compliance programs share a common problem around data and the data management. And that's what you're saying. The rules engine allows that to be manageable. Manageable not only in the 3 to 5 different platforms that we have in the organization, but in this single platform. And those rules can be built in to do that. And you mentioned Splunk there. So, we're talking about internal compliance audits. And I think sometimes that's maybe forgotten about. We're dealing so much with regards to our customers and also external bodies that sometimes we forget what we've promised our internal organizations and the access to that information.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Before we move on, Charlie, another thought just jumped into my mind. We're talking about this rules engine and ingestion processes. I think we should spend a little bit of time talking about what those data sources are. Mm-hmm. So the rules engine, I'll start there. It's a very simple, it's actually complex, I suppose, in the back end. But for our end users, it's a simple way of saying data that meets this criteria needs to have these actions. And it's mostly used right now to set your retention policy. So a lot of organizations have groups or skills that are applied to their interactions as they come into our system. And based on those groups or skills, we're able to apply a retention policy to automatically purge the data. That's all managed through our rules engine. And our rules engine is a back-end application within Continuity Replay that integrates with all of our ingestion processes. So I'll start there. We integrate with several CCaaS vendors to automatically ingest data on an ongoing basis, and we're able to set the retention period as it comes into the system. And then we have what we call a standard ingestion process, and that's for really migrating your legacy on-prem data into Continuity Replay. We're able to integrate with the rules engine through that process as well. But what's really cool about this your retention periods might shift over time, or you might have data in Continuity Replay that doesn't currently have a retention period set. Using our rules engine, you can go into Continuity Replay and apply that on the fly to either change existing policies or add policies where they didn't previously apply, and then we'll process that for you and update that retention period in the back end.
Essentially, this sounds pretty cool. The rules engine seems to be the heart of the application when it comes to it. Yeah. And I guess with that rules engine, we can understand the inputs from the other platforms. I guess from that, my question, I kind of know the answer. And again, this is a leading question for you, but, we talked about audits and internal compliance and all that kind of good stuff. But what we didn't talk about, which I found is really important to organizations, is data sovereignty.
Yeah.
And when it comes to cloud, you typically have a platform. How do we, for the audience watching, maybe you can explain how we deal with the kind of requirements around data sovereignty. And what I mean by that is, where is the data stored, and that type of thing.
It's a great leading question, Charlie. So we have a couple of ways of addressing this, right? So we have some customers currently have some pretty strict data sovereignty rules. And to appease them, we are actually doing different deployments of Continuity Replay on a per region basis, right? So for each country, region, area that you want to keep your data in, we're doing a full deployment of the web application as well as the backend and our storage to keep all of that data within those boundaries, so data never actually leaves that region. So that's an option for some customers. Now, I mentioned earlier that not every architecture and deployment of Continuity Replay is the same, and this is one of the reasons it's not. Some customers don't have such strict regulations around data sovereignty, and what that means is we can have one central instance of Continuity Replay deployed in a region of your choosing, but that can be backed by storage around the globe. So we might have your Continuity Replay deployed in the U.S., and you might have some U.S. backed storage, and you might have some Asia backed storage, or some EU backed storage, but we'll serve it all through our one central front end. Now, what's the deciding factor there? And it really comes down to whether or not data is ever allowed to leave the boundaries of a particular region for an organization. Some organizations are comfortable as long as when the data is at rest, it's in its country of origin, right? And then it never leaves there. Some companies are a little more strict and prefer individual deployments to make sure that that data never leaves the region.
Okay. Well, I think, just looking at the time there is probably time for us to begin to wrap this up. And I say that because a few questions have come in on the chat. Emily, you still there?
Yeah, I'm here. Good conversation, guys. Hopefully that was beneficial to everyone who listened. I have been monitoring the chat, and we've seen quite a few questions come in now. But before I run into those, I just wanted to ask Charlie and Bob if you could share more of a specific example of maybe one or how multiple of these scenarios have come to fruition in front of Wilmac, and then how Continuity Replay has been able to address that specific challenge.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I could maybe go first there. There's a couple of stories that come to mind. We talked about mergers and acquisition and divestiture earlier on in the call. But specifically, there was one organization that came to us, and they had to separate their data. I think they had over, I think it was like 500 million calls. And their services, or they essentially sold the service to another organization, which included the customer. So the customer and everything was moved across, the accounts were moved across. So they had to move across the calls that were associated with those customers. They had a single recording platform. The recording platform couldn't separate or export. More importantly, it was encrypted, and you couldn't play those calls, those interactions in any other system. So we helped this organization split the data out, decrypt it, and pass it over to the new company that was dealing with that data. So I think that was a really smooth transaction for us. It certainly made it easy for the new organization to ingest the data. They had a platform, Continuity Replay. They had the call data. It was all there. They didn't need to invest in another company's recording platform. So that kept the cost of that down. A second story for me, and I think we were just kind of touching on it there, Bob, with the regards to the data location, is working with an organization who had an on-premise platform. And in their historical days, when they were recording calls, they had calls across the border, so both in the US and Canada. When they moved to a cloud environment, they had a US cloud and a Canadian cloud, CCAS platform, and they wanted to ensure that their legacy calls, their historical calls, were also separated in that manner. So we were able to filter the data, separate the data, and provide them with two data repositories for their Canadian and their US calls.
Yeah, Charlie stole my example, so I'm just going to expand on that a little bit instead of trying to make up a new one. So yeah, we had this migration from an on-prem to a cloud system. So what we had to deliver for Continuity Replay Cloud was the ingestion of the legacy data, which was kind of one project, right? And then the next project was integrating with their production CCAS system to ingest data on an ongoing basis. Now, they had made the transition about a year prior to signing up with Wilmac and onboarding the Continuity Replay Cloud. So we actually had to go through and ingest all of their, we call it historical data, from their production system. Again, it was about a year's worth of data where we kind of had to catch up before we turned on the automated, daily ingestion of that production data. A couple of other interesting things that came up to this, right? Because they had the on-prem legacy system and the production system, we have a concept within Continuity Replay called sites that gives us kind of clear way to delineate between data sources. So we were able to separate it out by one site for the legacy on-prem data, another site for their production data. What's really great about that is that ties very well into our RBAC system within Continuity Replay. So you might have users within your organization that are allowed to see data from one system and not another. But we were able to work with this customer to identify who can do what within these different systems and build out the appropriate roles based on their business use cases to achieve that.
Okay, perfect. That answered my question. Thank you guys for sharing. I think what's so unique about this conversation is the fact that every organization, probably every person on this call, their technology situation is so different from one another. But the fact that there's a simpler way to go about it than to spend time and money and resources on managing a legacy system or using, like you said, cloud vendor provision storage that's more expensive. It's almost just greater awareness, greater education on the options that are out there. And I think that's something that I wanted to call out with Continuity Replay is just the fact that there are people on this call who were with us multiple years ago who were impacting what Continuity Replay looks like now. And really your feedback, your questions that you're asking within this webinar, that's what we take and look at day to day to influence what our roadmap looks like down the line. So I just wanted to make sure I pointed that out before we jump into the Q&A now, because like I said, we did have quite a few questions come in over the course of the last half hour or so. So to start, large language models, they used to be considered risky for compliance. How can AI be used in the scenarios you discussed? And then what do future plans look like? We'll start with that one.
Yeah, I'll jump right in on that one. We're not using large language models against our interaction data within Continuity Replay. We're using AI to help us automate our reporting, automate our tasks within the system. A lot of areas where AI could be beneficial, we've really found those are already being handled upstream, kind of by the source, right? Things like IVA training, right? Is that the right term? IVA? Yeah. Things like that are typically where you're seeing AI being applied in the contact center world. And there's just not a strong use case for that when you're talking about, your central repository, especially when it comes to legacy data, right? Another interesting thing, if you have legacy data from 7, 8 years ago, you probably weren't even asking your customers if it was okay if you could use that data, right? So there's a little bit of an ethical line that we have to be very conscious of as we're building out continuity replay, and in particular with the AI features and functionality that we want to build into the platform.
Awesome. Okay, thanks for answering that, Bob. Okay, moving on to the next one. I'm going to throw this one to Charlie. Can you help us filter our data and what we need to keep versus what we kept in the past? Charlie?
Yeah, we touched on that earlier on in the call. Specifically to answer that question, yes, we can. We can help you filter out the data. How do we do that, or how can we do that? Well, there's a couple of ways. We can filter the data prior to the ingestion into continuity replay, so you can see all of that data in one single place. It might be that you want to filter the data before you ingest it into continuity replay. So we have services that supports that, database parsing, that type of thing, which allows us to filter based on any of the criteria that you have. If you take, for instance, the story before when we were talking about Canada and the US, we had to identify those users by specific queues and specific work groups. So if you think about how you report on data today, then we can use that same kind of reporting mechanism that you've used in the past to split and separate your data and provide you with a data set that you really want to keep.
Can I build on that as well?
Go for it.
Right. When it comes to filtering, a lot of times our customers are filtering because they need to perform an action against the data set. And I'm thinking very much right now about setting those retention policies. We have a customer where we're ingesting some legacy data, and their retention policies mean that a bunch of that data is immediately going to get purged from the system. Right. So the way that we're handling that is by gathering what those queries would be. And then producing a report. So we're staging the data before we actually take action against it, so that we can sit down with the customer and review, this is what's going to happen if we apply this retention policy using these filters. Here's the data that's going to get purged from the system, and make sure that it's really good to go before we actually apply it within continuity replay.
Okay, that's interesting. Thanks for sharing that, Bob, and for answering that question, Charlie. Okay, and I think the last one that we have time for this morning, here we go. Okay, what does the future of the solution look like, and any sneak peeks of the roadmap that you can give?
I think that one's squarely in Bob's.
Squarely in mine? Wow, awesome. I guess let me address my favorite thing to talk about, which is user experience. We launched Continuity Replay Cloud back in June, and we've spent the last couple of months really focused on what's the best way to organize our filters, what's the best way to display these large grids of data, what's the best way to filter it down, what's the best way to add customization. So those are areas where we're really focused on now. We have some more, I refer to them as quality of life, because they're not, big bang features in and of themselves. But overall, as we kind of increment and make these smaller changes to the user experience, it just makes for a better product overall. We're redoing our media player right now, which is going to be really awesome. It's going to be one central media player that can handle any type of media we want to throw at it, whether it be a recorded call or screen or video, text, email. All your omni-channel interactions that are going to come in the system are going to be able to go through one media player that's going to give you all the functionality we need. So I'm really excited that we're spending time there. The next major area is expanding our production CCaaS systems that we integrate with. We're working through defining and I guess writing up what the developers have to do in the back end for a couple of big ones coming up. We're even talking about what happens if you have some system that doesn't have like a public API that we can integrate with. What are the paths that we're going to build out within Continuity Replay that will allow our customers to give us that data so that we can still ingest it. So that's a really great area that we're focused on. And then I think the final one I'll pick on, reporting. This is one we've been talking about a lot, and there's different ways reporting can apply. One is building out some dashboards on what your system looks like, so you across all of your interactions. I'm thinking of things like, the number of calls per agent over the course of time, total number of interactions within our system, how many interactions are you getting based on the channel, whether it's voice, screen, text, chat, all those sorts of things. And then being able, off of those reports, to be able to show you trends and give you analysis on maybe how your contact center has shifted over the course of time, right? Because, 10 years ago, you were probably really heavily call focused. But obviously, organizations are shifting a lot. We've got a lot of web chats now that are coming in. So being able to see how your organization is shifting over time through continuity replay is a great report we're focused in on. And we're also talking about building compliance reporting. So this is largely going to be based off of, again, our audit logs. So this is really, Charlie mentioned that use case of doing your own internal audits to make sure that you're meeting your policy requirements and things of that nature. Being able to build out a really nice dashboard that's just going to show you what things are wrong and then what you have to do to remediate those issues.
A lot of exciting stuff, as
yes.
you tell. Bob likes what he's doing. Okay. All right. Thanks to everyone who entered questions in the chat. If I didn't get to yours this morning, we'll make sure to follow up with you individually. Before I wrap us up, Bob and Charlie, was there anything else that you'd like to mention before I close?
I think I'm good. Yeah, I think everything we've covered is vital to the conversation that you have when you want to move big swatches of data like call recordings or screen recordings, that type of thing. So I think we've pretty much covered everything that I wanted to do today.
Yeah.
I'll give a quick plug to the way that we operate and build out continuity replay. And, folks that know Wilmac well has probably heard us say a bunch. We're really customer focused in terms of our roadmap and what we're building. And I think this applies so much to the world of security and compliance, because that topic is not static, right? It shifts. It evolves, it expands over time. What we're building today is going to need more over the next few months, over the next few years. So really would love to hear from the audience, what things are on, in your targets when it comes to security and compliance, and how can continuity replay help you to fill that gap?
Great. Thanks, Bob. Thanks, Charlie. Okay. Thank you to everyone who joined us for our webinar this morning. 3 scenarios you find yourself in simplifying compliance with customer interaction data. We talked about 3 main challenges and scenarios that we see people like you face all the time and then not know how to navigate, or at least in the most effective way possible. So we talked about transitioning and decommissioning legacy systems, going through M&A and having multiple modalities or multiple environments that are holding your data, and along with facing audits, which who likes facing an audit? No one. So we talked about those 3 scenarios. If you think of any questions or comments, like I mentioned before, you can insert them on the left-hand side of your screen or the survey that pops up afterwards. Any topics, what Bob just asked, those types of things you can enter in there. Up on the screen for Charlie and Bob, you'll actually see 2 QR codes linking to their LinkedIn pages, plug in for their personal brands for sure, along with their email addresses. They post a lot of great content about what they're seeing day to day, what conversations they're having with customers, and provide a lot of extra insight there. So I suggest connecting with them. And okay, like I mentioned, there's going to be a quick survey that pops up after you leave, 3 survey questions. We just want to better understand the challenges that you're facing so we can do host more conversations like this, and so we can tailor those future webinars to your topics. So I will say, if you haven't yet, I suggest downloading any of those available resources that I mentioned at the beginning. The one that I recommend the most is the 5 benefits ebook, and it's not because Charlie and Bob and I all co-authored it, but because it's packed full of very relevant info of what we spoke about today. So thank you for your time, Bob and Charlie. Thank you again for sharing your insights with the audience today. This will be available as a recording afterwards and on our biweekly podcast, the Wilmac Wire. So you'll be able to find it and come back to it anytime you need. So again, thanks for your time and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Wilmac Wire. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing on your favorite podcast platform or visiting our website at www.wilmactech.com. You can also watch the full video recordings of every episode on our YouTube channel. Thank you for being a part of our community, and again, thank you for listening to the Wilmac Wire.